You're listening to Speaking of Faith with Bishop D.D. Duncan Proby of the Episcopal Diocese of Central New York. I'm Rachel Ravelette, or Romcom, and we're glad you're here.
Welcome to the podcast, Speaking of Faith. I am Bishop D.D. Duncan Proby of the Diocese of Central New York. That's Canada to Pennsylvania and Utica to Elmira, and all the beautiful places and people in between. I'm joined by Rachel Ravelette, our Director of Communications, and I am so excited to talk with you about faith and for all of us to practice and think about how we speak of faith, especially in this time and in this place as we are dealing with all that life is. Last week on Speaking with Faith, we did a first part to today's on gun violence, and today is going to be part 2. And last week we talked a bit about the killing of Naya in Utica and about police, and it's so often our conversations about gun safety and gun violence become really exclusive of any ability to have real conversation, to actually speak of our faith in helpful ways. I mentioned that I grew up with guns in a family of hunters and military people, and even for a time my father was a sheriff. And so I grew up understanding that guns had a purpose, and we weren't allowed to use guns until we could utilize them effectively, till we knew about safe handling, about cleaning appropriately, about how to manage ourselves, and how to be around guns as a responsible person. And I acknowledge and will always acknowledge that most gun owners pride themselves on their responsible gun ownership, that they've done the training, that they know how to use gun locks, that they lock up their guns, they keep the bullets separate from the guns at night. And so in this space of speaking about our faith, and especially speaking about our faith with gun violence, this is a place for all of us to have good conversation rather than to split off and talk about our positions. Let's talk about our shared interests. Let's build some capacity to have deeper, more impactful, and more helpful conversations about the epidemic of the gun violence in America. Now, I did not speak about this last week, but it occurs to me I should also share that from 1990 to 1992, I worked at a school in Los Angeles that was populated by students who were either on their way to or coming back from California Youth Authority and imprisonment. These are kids who were involved in different gangs and rival gangs. And so we talked a lot about gun violence as teachers in that school with our students. I remember one student in particular. He had been heavily involved in the gang. He was trying to make good choices in his life, and he started working at a local grocery store. And a rival gang put a hit out on him, and a hit at that time was the nomenclature for they wanted to really kill him or rough him up badly harm him. And his own gang at that time was also recognizing that he was kind of moving away from being a faithful gang member. And so there was some, jumping him out would be the language they were using at the time, which was also very dangerous for this young man. It meant that there were people who really were seeking to specifically harm him. So when he heard about this, he went to his job and he took with him a pistol and put it in his locker at the grocery store because he was wanting to protect himself on the way to and from the store. Well, his manager heard about it and he was fired, and he was so confused when he came to school the next day. He said, "Doesn't my manager want me to be safe? A gun is a sign of respect. A gun is a way that I protect myself. Why can't I protect myself? Why doesn't the store manager understand that?" And in talking with him, I still remember to this day the impossibility of trying to talk about gun safety and gun violence with this young man for whom the purpose of a gun was respect and protection. Today, I hear people using those same words, saying that, having a gun in the home is the way I protect my family. Having a gun is the way that I ensure that I will be respected and won't be put in a harmful situation. It's important for us to talk about how we see the purpose of guns and what it is that our beliefs about guns may be. A lot of times we talk about the purpose of a gun being killing someone. Certainly there's hunting, there's sustenance people, there's people who are protecting their homes, there are farmers and ranchers, there are people in all sorts of places in life where owning a gun is an essential part of self-protection. And certainly I want to note here that for people of color, there has long been an understanding of a need to be able to protect one's home from racist threats. And so when we talk about the purpose of guns, it's disingenuous to try to reduce it down to guns are bad, because sometimes guns are necessary and guns are the way people can be sustainable. And so for you and for me, I think starting with the question of what do we believe the purpose of a gun to be? And how do we understand that purpose? And yes, that guns are intended to kill something. The follow-up question becomes, what is killing us? What about gun ownership are we not willing to see or understand because we're holding on too tightly? In this time, civically, we have high rates of depression, of isolation, of fear, of dehumanization of one another. If you believe in gun rights, then you're one of those people. If you're opposed to people owning guns in their home, you're one of those people. We reduce this down to a binary. In order for us to speak of our faith, we have to start from a better place than that, from these isolated positions. We need to start from a place of shared interests. And so safety is a shared interest. The ability to provide for one's family, a shared interest. And I would dare say that safe gun handling is also a shared interest. If you talk to people who are part of gun clubs or who are regularly utilizing guns in their lives, they're going to talk about the importance and the essential nature of gun safety. So having this conversation about gun violence, in some ways it's a conversation about how are we safe? What does it mean to own guns? And as my student even said, how do we protect ourselves and how do we ensure that we will be respected in dangerous situations? Rachel, I've talked a lot about a lot of things here, but I want to open up this conversation a little bit. And for those of you who are listening, to think in your own heart about your feelings about guns. I will say I do not hate guns. I recognize their viability and the value of them. I don't even hate AR-15s for farmers who are dealing with wild boars or people who are living in situations where I don't have an understanding of what it is they're facing. But I do have issues with the accessibility of weapons of war. And but let me stop there, Rachel, and let you join in the conversation a bit. What is your feeling like when you speak about guns? How do some of these things play into the way you speak about guns?
Well, Bishop, I think when I was younger, I was very much in that binary that guns are bad. And anybody who wanted to have a gun for any reason, there was no purpose in our modern age where you can go to the grocery store and get food. There's no purpose for them. But I've had several experiences that have helped me to broaden my understanding and get out of that black and white thinking. Mm-hmm. My younger brother is a sergeant in the Michigan State Police, and all kinds of tensions there between, I don't want him to get shot at, and I don't want him to get shot out without having a gun in a way to protect himself. Uh-huh. And so that's a tension that has risen in me. And then, my family lives on a farm, and the red meat that we eat comes from the herd of deer that live on our acreage. and we have livestock. And once you put that much money into some chickens and heritage breed turkeys, you don't really want a coyote to come and eat them
That's
all.
right. That's right.
But I think the most eye-opening experience was I was in a racial conciliation group, and we started talking about, okay, our next action is going to be on gun control. And this was still when I was thinking in very black and white terms. And I'll never forget, a black pastor stood up and said, "You will take my gun from me if I am dead." Because for so long, my ancestors weren't allowed
Mhm.
to have a gun to protect themselves. And my family isn't as safe here as your family. And
Mhm.
so it can be painful. It's easy sometimes to be in black and white thinking,
Mhm.
and it shuts off some of that critical thinking.
Mhm.
But it's a good and challenging experience to broaden your perspective and really listen to other people and not immediately vilify them. It's hard.
Mhm. It is hard because especially when we believe strongly and have deep feelings, and some of us have been people whose families have been victims of gun violence. Some of us have had experiences where there's been trauma related to guns. And so there is, it's essential that in this conversation that there be a willingness to listen to one another's pain and to respect that we can both have opinions. We can even have our own opinions, even in ourselves, that are very different. We can see the trauma and we can see the value and recognize that there are two goods at work here, that there is not only one side is valid. And especially when you're talking about, we should get rid of all the guns. Well, that is naive and really, to be honest, ignorant thinking, because that's being
Very
unaware
privileged.
of and very privileged. We live in a world where reason, rationality don't always produce the results we think. There are situations where we need to be able to protect ourselves and to have better understandings of what that means. When I talk about sane gun legislation, which as a bishop united against gun violence, because I am, and I talk about and when I've advocated for sane gun legislation, I am not advocating for guns to be taken away because I respect the Second Amendment and people's desire for guns. But I am advocating for legislation that helps to protect society from from for how guns are distributed and how they're made. One of the things we often overlook in this conversation are bullets. We talk an awful lot about guns and talk very little about cop killer bullets or how the bullets have been developed to explode when they hit a body. When you're talking especially about Second Amendment and we're discussing, musket fire, it took quite a few minutes for a musket to be fired and reloaded. And then you're talking about a specific ball or even scatter shot, but it was specific. The bullets nowadays a lot of them have been developed as weapons of war to do maximum damage to a body, to ensure harm. And that conversation about bullets is really essential, but again, needs to happen with a full understanding that there's not one good or there's not one way of understanding. These are complex issues, and we need to have complex, respectful conversation. I am speaking especially from as an Episcopal bishop. We have talked a great deal in these podcasts, and I would encourage those of you who are listening to go back and listen to the first few, 6 or 8 podcasts, because I did a lot of talking about the baptismal covenant, about how we live in community with one another, about standards of behavior, and especially how we conduct ourselves as followers of Jesus. Jesus commands us to love God with all that we are, with every aspect of our life, and then to love our neighbor as ourselves, to seek the well-being of another. We're called to pray for our enemies. We're called to offer a cup of cold water to strangers. We're commanded by Jesus to care about others in our world. And so when we speak about gun violence, an essential aspect of it as people who follow Jesus is to listen and to consider other interests and to refrain from taking a position against another person. We can feel very strongly that we're right, but when we stop listening and stop respecting a different point of view, then we've become part of the problem. We've become part of what is driving our inability to actually address gun violence in America. Epidemic proportions, if you look at the number of gun deaths each day and each year, each month, exponentially, it doesn't even relate or compute with the rest of the world. We have so much gun violence in the United States. And we believe in freedom and liberty, in the pursuit of happiness, and we believe in public dialogue, that it is in our public engagement with one another that we talk about these issues. So on this podcast, speaking of faith, it is essential that we talk about gun violence, not from a partisan standpoint, not from a position standpoint, but talking about shared interests, talking about the truth and reality of what happens in our world. I often think about the young man who was in my class, who was working at that grocery store, who himself was a victim of gun violence. He had been shot before. His family had experienced the trauma of not being safe in the inner cities. And I wonder what happened to him after I left that school. Not that it was all about me at all, but he was one of the people that I was a mentor for, and I've wondered how his life has turned out. All of us together are called by God, and however we understand God, to work for the betterment of the people around us, to act in moral and appropriate ways, because those people, whoever they may be for you, for me, are also loved by God. So in this conversation about gun violence, as advocates for the safety of people, it is important that we continue to listen and understand that instead of reactionary emotionality, that we take a minute, that we pray for one another, and with sober consideration, we look at the reality of what is happening in our world and for ourselves. We have an epidemic of fear. We have an epidemic of isolation happening. And so our first step when we talk about any solution is going to be to look at those aspects of our life and to seek mutually beneficial solutions. So in this podcast, I encourage each of us to think about how we live together as people of faith, how our words of faith make room and space for all of us to be well-reasoned and thoughtful, to think about the ways in which what we advocate for allows us greater ability to seek and serve Christ in all persons, that we work diligently and with perseverance and with dedication to help and aid those who are suffering and who are not safe and who are seeking greater opportunities in their life. And let us never forget that inherent to this conversation is race, culture, economic availability, and all that is part of a social society. I encourage you, as you pray about and have thoughts about this podcast, to share with us some of your thoughts, and also to find someone that you feel safe talking with and have conversations. What is the purpose of a gun? How do you understand gun usage? And especially if you're a gun owner, that you consider again the safety of the people around you, that guns are locked, that the bullets are separate from the guns, that when we utilize guns, we have an understanding and the competency to ensure the safety of others. I appreciate you being part of this podcast. Next week, we'll talk more about building community across difference. I can't help but use the title because I was co-chair of the Building Community Across Difference Task Force for the Episcopal Church. It's important, essential work in this time when so many of us are divided arbitrarily along lines. Let us find our shared interests and let us have good conversations, that we speak of our faith and that we love our God and love one another with the love of God. May you be blessed.
Thanks for
and be a
joining
blessing.
us.
And I look
Speaking
forward
of
to talking
Faith with
you
Bishop Didi
soon.
is a production of the Episcopal Diocese of Central New York. Our theme music is by Fleece Mob, and it's called A Bird in Hand. We use it with permission. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast through your favorite podcasting app so that you can be the first to know when new episodes are available. If you like what you've heard here, please leave us a rating and review. If you don't like what you've heard here, we're sure you're still a wonderful person, but maybe don't leave us a review? Just kidding. We love honest feedback and questions. You can connect with us online between episodes at cnyepiscopal.org/podcast and on social media at CNY Episcopal. Blessings to you, friends.